Hello guys, we're team number 3 and we are going to talk about Mexico's international principles. So let's get started. For an introduction, I'm going to talk about Mexico's international context, and for point number 1, we have that Mexico has no territorial ambitions. The only territorial ambitions Mexico has ever had were for Belize's territory, but we quit on that because we wanted to respect the self-determination right Belize's people had. So, this means that Mexico has no assigned budget for expansionism purposes right now. Number 2, Mexico's participation in wars have been merely defensive. This means that we have not attacked or been offensive aggressive with other countries trying to get, for say, their land, their gold, their resources, their people. We have only defended ourselves in wars. Number 3, Mexico's principles have always been directed to respect and keep international rights and laws, encouraging solidarity among nations, even when some of the decisions that were made went against Mexico's interests. Number 4, Mexico's army has been reduced to an almost symbolic organism which is in favor and service of the people, instead of being an institution that seeks to achieve its own goals. As a proof of this, we can see the army's budget, which is a really small portion of the Mexico's GDP. And now, let's talk about the TEMEC, which in English would be the USMCA, that is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It's the new free trade agreement between the 3 northern countries of America, and it's meant to be an improvement of the former treaty, the NAFTA. Okay, so now let's get to know some of the main differences between the NAFTA and the TEMEC. First of all, the new TEMEC will have a duration of 16 years, and it can be extended for another 16 years in case the 3 countries want it to. And other main changes or differences between NAFTA and TEMEC are the easier access to Canadian dairy market. The dairy market is the milky products market, so that Canada can export easily to Mexico and the USA milky products. Number 2, the increase of the limit of vehicles that can be exported to the USA from both Mexico or Canada, meaning that we can send more cars to be sold in the USA. The periodical revisions of the treaty every 6 years, meaning that every 6 years the 3 countries will check on the treaty to see if they want to change something or if they want to remain that way. Some of the changes that are being implemented with the TEMEC are the reinforcement on workers' laws and rights, so that no labor force will suffer from injustice in the 3 countries, and a market-determined exchange rate with no interventions, meaning that the market will determine the price of every currency from the 3 countries, the Canadian dollar, the dollar, and the Mexican peso.
Hi everyone, hope you're doing great in your houses. I'm going to be talking to you about the self-determination and no-intervention principle. Well, as you already know, this has been like a really big thing for Mexico throughout history. It's a really representative principle that Mexico's always been like known for. And also, these 2 things are counterpart of each other. In order for you to have self-determination of a state, you must have the no-intervention part. So they go like together. Here we have Adolfo López Mateos in the 5th report to the nation, the Quinto Informe para la Nación. And here it was where they put out the 3 most important things about this principle. First one is the independence and sovereignty part of a state. This one talks about having as a result the principles of equality, no intervention, and self-determination of each state. The second one, the cooperation part, basically talks only about self-determination of states and how this one has an implicit cooperation between them to help each other. That's why the third one, the peace and international safety part, it's like the most important because it talks all about how these self-determined countries should work together into maintaining the international safety, and peace within each other in cooperation altogether, basically. It's also important to mention the General Assembly Resolution 2131. That's the name. It was done on December 1965. It was done in the Inter-American System Reunion. And this declaration was a really important thing because Mexico was a big supporter of it. It basically talked about how there should be an inadmissibility of intervention in the domestic affairs of every state so that it would protect their freedom and their independence as states. So the important thing that I want to bring to your attention is that here Mexico is already acknowledging it, that if there's any state, let's say the US, that's able to intervene a different state, let's say the Middle East, the self-determination principle cannot properly work. It doesn't exist as it is. So there's a lot of examples that Mexico's always been strongly approval of. It would be like when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, now known as the Czech Republic, and some of those, and also when the Dominican Republic was intervened by the U.S., or a lot of other states that had been intervened by the U.S. Mexico's always been famous for that. So yeah, basically, that's the self-determination principle, and that's like some of the examples that you probably already know.
Mexico defends the rigid application of the no-intervention principle, which is a consequence of self-determination principle, and opposes to any kind of interference that may be tried in the affairs of certain countries, under the excuse of the no-intervention principle, which happened in Hungary and Cuba cases. Although they seem to be found in Mexico's practice exceptions to the no-intervention principle, analyzing these exceptions in depth, we'll see that those actions actually are a defense to the self-determination principle. In the examples of Hungary and Cuba, the problem is of internal order. To be precise, the political regime of a state is a question that the states of the respective countries must solve for themselves. Mexico doesn't consider this problem of internal order, and this is because the states subjected to the colonial regime are different to the states imposing the colonial rule. Mexico demands that the right of self-determination is granted to those colonies, since the questionable solutions that have been offered, attributing the character of overseas provinces to those colonies, cannot always be accepted, because they actually are total different nations in legal status. The case of Gibraltar was that the County of the 24 requested from England to agree with Spain to end the colonial status of Gibraltar, which, despite of not being an autonomous territory for its status as a colony, has full autonomy. Mexico held a neutral position in this topic. Since the current population of Gibraltar is a population artificially maintained by the Spanish residence ban, the problem of Gibraltar is a problem of Spain, and not a transitory regime conceding in the claim of the Spanish of all political nonsense, for which reason the relations with the Franco government are not an excuse. Now, the apartheid policy of the South African Republic was a policy of racial segregation, and Mexico does not accept that in the behalf of the self-determination principles, any regime tries to subdue other people and deprive them from their political rights just because they are within their borders. Mexico suggests the application of coercive measures in these cases in order to enforce respect for fundamental principles on which the human community is found.
Mexico has been an uncommitted country with any of the Asian poles of the world, that were present in the last century. This attitude has led him to draw a line from anything that could be seen as a third pole, which, in my opinion, might be able to explain why they decided not to be part of the meetings organized in El Cairo and in Belgrado, notwithstanding all the limitations imposed by its geographic location. This country has shown an important independence from its northern neighbor. Proof has been its condemnation to their intervention in the Dominican Republic affairs, or its disagreement to the terms settled by the OAS concerning Cuba. Even when the aggression has come from someone different to the USA, the refusal to these actions from our country has been the same. Nevertheless, Mexico cannot be classified as a politically neutral country, but it remains as an example of a modern Western democracy.
Hi, to talk about the security in this matter, Mexico restrictively interprets the power of regional organization, reserving to the UN, United Nations, the power to decide collective action. For this reason, Mexico has opposed to the interpretation that have been given to the Rios Treaty, which expanded the concept of aggression and granted the OAS, that means Organization of American States, the power to decide the application for coercive measures. Despite the evident legal basis of Mexico's position on collective security in America, a political explanation must be sought to its attitude. Within American continent, the influence of United States is determinant. There is no other power capable for counterbalancing it. That is why it would be extremely dangerous for political Mexico to accept OAS, where United States is decisive, has the power to take coercive measure. Mexico decided to deny the OAS these powers and attribute them to the United Nations, which, on the other hand, is what the correct interpretation of the laws would allow us to decide. But what is the Rios Treaty? Well, the Rios Treaty provides for a collective security mechanism. For example, under its term, an armed attack on one member is to be considered an attack of all. But it also provides for measures to address aggression that are not armed attack, as well as intracontinental or extracontinental conflicts, or any other fact or situation that might endanger the peace of America.
Hello there, my name is Juan Carlos and I am going to talk about the pacifist principle in the foreign policy of Mexico. This principle is one of the most important principles in the relation of Mexico with other countries, because this principle embodies the guidelines to how every country should act and how they can resolve the disputes in the most specific way possible. This specific principle was first introduced in the 7th Pan American Conference in Montevideo. It was embodied in the document known as the Code of Peace. Here, this code embodies the guidelines and the foundation of how every country should act in every dispute in the most pacific way possible. As we can see here, the pacifism in Mexico is understood in a triple approach. I'm going to talk about these three approaches that are taken from the Code of Peace presented by Mexico in the Pan American Conference in Montevideo. The first principle established an international organization, and this organization seeks the way to enforce the law and prevent any injustice of every country that is within the organization. The second approach is the organization of the methods of how every country should act to maintain the disputes in the most low level possible, because if it escalates, the despotity can endanger the organization that is being founded on the first approach. The third approach is the realization of universal disarmament. Now, I'm going to give the stage to my next teammate, and that will be all for me.
International Organization Principle. In the matter of this, we will find the role that Mexico has played in some universal organizations, such as the United Nations, and in some regional organizations, like the Pan American Union. For being part of these organizations, Mexico has some general international organization principles that guide these relationships. First principle, the absolute necessity of creating an international universal organization for guaranteeing the international security of every member state of that international organization. Second principle, the equality principle of every member state of that organization. Number 3, the universality principle. It means that every state of the world must be a member of this universal organization, taking care of the individual right of each state of getting out of it, and also the organization's rights of taking them out if they mean a risk for the organization existence. Number 4, the self-determination of people principle. It guarantees the rights of minorities and of the populations that are subject to the colonial rule. Number 5, the acceptance from the member states of the limitations of their sovereignty, for understanding that by entering to this organization, the member states gain some rights, but also they gain some obligations, that most of them involve of giving up a part of their sovereignty. Number 6, the affirmation that the organization must have the necessary force to apply the sanctions that the maintaining of the right must. Number 7, coexistence and the necessity of defining aggression for preventing it. Also, the establishing of repression measures if it happens. This has been realized by the United Nations. Number 8, the necessity of having other international organizations to promote the economic development and other necessities that the member countries may have.
In 1967 and ratified on September 20. And then, after having supported through the laborious talks leading to its conclusion, the Treaty for the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, Mexico signed it on July 26, 1968, and deposited its ratification on January 31, 1971. Now, the disarmament agreements of which Mexico is part. The first, the protocol relating to the prohibition of the use in war of asphyxiating, toxic, or similar gases and bacteriological means. B, the treaty banning nuclear weapon testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. C, the treaty on the principle that must govern the activities of state in the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. D, the Treaty of Tlatelolco. E, Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. F, the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, and Storage of Bacteriological and Toxic Weapons and on their destruction. G, the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons that can be considered excessively harmful. And H, the Treaty on the Prohibition of the Use of Nuclear Weapons and Other Weapons of Mass Destruction on the sea and ocean, funds, and their subsoil. All these agreements are really descriptive on their names, so this is the reason why I don't add a description of this, but I think that all of the
Now I will talk about the human rights in Mexico. In our country, they have occupied a very important place, both constitutionally and internationally. First, in the international field, I can tell you about the Charter of the United Nations, where Mexico is part of it, and we have the obligation of following its rules, mainly the legal ones, in addition to having voted in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have had many other agreements, like the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, both approved by the Senate in December 18 of 1980. Now we pass to the regional field, where Mexico has ratified the American Convention of Human Rights in December 22 of 1969, better known as the Pacto de San Jose. We all know that in Mexico the place of women has been very difficult to support, but one of the first measures taken was that we entered to the Convention of Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women in July 17 of 1980, being approved that agreement on December of the same year. Finally, we took part of the ONU agreements to support the migrants, the women, and the young girls.
We're going to talk about diplomatic and territorial asylum. First of all, we need to understand the difference between territorial and diplomatic asylum. The word diplomatic means that it is requested for diplomatic missions, while territorial asylum can be requested within the borders the state that is asked to grant asylum. Mexico is recognized because we have offered a lot of asylums to refugees, but especially to persecuted politicians. Now we're going to talk about extraditions. There is the definition, so I'm not gonna read it, but in a few words, extradition is this. If someone has committed a crime in a country and then he runs away, the country who offered asylum have to give him back, so this person could be judged according to the laws of his own country. So now we're going to talk about the elements that integrate extradition. The first one is a demand made by an executive authority to the state where the fugitive fled. The second one is to provide a copy of the indictment, and this indictment must be for treason, felony, or for other crime. As I already said, the third one, now we're going to go with the number 4, and this in a few words means that this document must be certified by the government where the crime was committed. And finally, the last 2 elements. The first one means that in the moment that this document is certified, the state where the criminal fled must arrest him. And then they must notify to the state that is requesting the fugitive. The last step to do is that an agent of the executive authority who requested extradition must appear to receive the fugitive within 30 days of the date of the arrest. And finally, but not less important, we have to talk about Article 15. And we're going to see some exceptions that Mexico does for extradition. And what are these exceptions? Well, Mexico does not authorize extradition when we're talking about a political prisoner. And according to the Article 15, extradition is not authorized if the person who committed the crime was in a status of a slave. And finally, extradition do not proceed if human rights of the person who committed the crime were not respected in the place in which he or she was.